Outron Oscail Náisiúnta Vietnam, Hanoi. An Dr. Nguyen Kim Sol, a hail si a galtaí is fuireann na hillscoile. President of Vietnam National University, Dr. Nguyen Kim Son, Excellencies, dear students, friends, distinguished guests. It is my very great pleasure to be here with you all in Hanoi, an ancient city of culture and the vibrant capital of a friendly nation. And I'm honored to be the first president to pay a state visit to the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. And I hope that my visit will contribute to sustaining and deepening the true and growing friendship that unites the peoples of Ireland and Vietnam. I want to thank all of you for the warmth of your welcome to Hanoi and to Vietnam, and I want to extend my sincere thanks to President Son for his invitation to address the student and academic body of this prestigious university. And indeed, I will be very happy to answer questions after my remarks. I have decided to exercise this invitation on a theme which is central to my visit to Vietnam in so many ways, and central to our nation's common future on this fragile planet, the theme of sustainable development. And I'm very pleased that I understand are gathered here this morning representatives from other educational institutions, together with representatives from a range of national and international organizations. Very importantly, youth groups, non-governmental organizations, and policy analysts. For all of you will have an integral part to play in crafting the new forms of international cooperation, diplomacy, economic and social policy that are now required and will be required ever more if we are to respond adequately both to the great possibilities and the risks of fragmentation which the latest technological revolutions and new balances of trade and political uncertainties have opened up in our global relationships. All of you are participants in a conversation that is arising from all quarters of the world on the pressing need for new models of development that are based on diversity and on ethical purpose. Most of you here are students for whom many futures are possible in what is an ever more interdependent world for which a pluralist scholarship is essential. You are invited to contribute to imagining and shaping a new form of globalization appropriate for your generation and for its future, one that can foster cohesion, social advancement, progress, and a balanced relationship between our human species and nature in all its forms. When I was a young postgraduate in the United States, along with other postgraduates from Asia and South America at Indiana University, we came to hear about development, about the obstacles that were regarded as existing in our own countries in achieving what was the model of the developed world. Orlando Fowles Boda would write back to South America and say, "We are being asked to look at our peoples and our history through the ideological glasses of others who want us to change to be just like them." All that scholarship is thankfully over. It is for that reason we need pluralist scholarship. And I'm so pleased that Ireland and Vietnam have this warm dialogue. This year, Ireland and Vietnam celebrate 20 years of diplomatic relations. And that might be a young formal relationship between our two countries, but it is built on the solid bedrock of mutual esteem, authentic understanding, and a deep commitment to take on the challenges I will mention in just a few moments. And there is so much shared experience in our respective histories. There are so many ways in which we Irish, when we acquaint ourselves with the history of Vietnam, can identify with both sympathy and imagination, with the aspirations of the Vietnamese people. For Ireland's national journey and the journey of Vietnam are journeys that chime. In new recollections we hear echoes of so much of our own path. Yours is a history of so much inflicted suffering by external powers. Suffering that, while it must not disable your present or deprive you of future possibilities, yet is so important that you never be asked to assume some false amnesia in its regard. Your history in its fullness belongs to you, and the world must learn from its imposed tragedies. As I prepared my remarks, I looked at the figures of death. Harvard Medical School, 3.8 million is the figure they have for loss of life. 1 million orphans, so many people disabled, vegetation destroyed, ecocide. And yet the lessons of this must be learned not only by those upon whom it was visited, but by its authors, and those who must have the courage to look at the intentions and the history of the policies that produced such devastation on a people. We will be encouraged in universities in the coming decades to go right back and recognize the great advances, for example, of the Enlightenment. But yet it is only a small minority of people within the Enlightenment that deliver it in a way to the rest of the world that is free from imperialism and domination. And both of our cultures have their roots in ancient civilizations, renowned for the value they placed on scholarly learning, spiritual cultivation, and the arts. And both of our peoples have endured, as I've said, the harmful experience of colonization, with its suggestion that those colonized are inevitably inferior to the colonizer. And in your case, the ambitions of 4 imperialisms. Both of our countries have suffered from the scourge of famine, the terror of the hungry grass, as Irish poet Donogh MacDonagh described it. Our famine was such that we were not able to name it for a long time. We just call it the Great Hunger, we just call it the famine, the year of the failure of the potato. Both of our nations also have suffered in cultural terms, as said, from those assumptions I have mentioned of imperialism, which sought to justify the racial superiority of the colonizer over the colonized by cultural impositions. Efforts to rationalize the ruling of the world by a handful of imperial powers. First, those to whom such views were directed were inferior almost in a species sense. Then they were backward. Then they were impractical. Then they were supposed to be incapable of embracing what was a very narrowly defined version of modernity that fitted very neatly with the expansion of existing powers. We recall the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, after that collision of empires that was the First World War, a conference to which a young Ho Chi Minh sent a petition asking for the delivery of the independence that had been promised from France. He did not receive an answer from the presiding world powers, and similarly too, the doors in Paris remained closed to that small delegation of Irish Republicans who travelled there in an attempt to garner support for the cause of independence for Ireland from the British Empire. Both rejections were perceived by the Irish and Vietnamese leaders of the time, young men and women, and they were constructed as further proof of the risk of placing trust in concessions from an imperial power. And yet, the future we are entering now is one that requires trust And we must have trust, and that is so dependent on the quality of the ideas that we will hold in common and the pluralism that will be available in our institutions of learning. As the Paris conference was unfolding, just a few years after the Easter Rising of 1916, where in Ireland a few thousand brave men and women rose to defy the power of the British Empire, which was so close to them. This was for us in Irish history a milestone event on the path to Irish independence, an event of which we in Ireland are celebrating this year. And we do so with what I have called a hospitality of narratives, allowing every story to be placed side by side, but never affecting some kind of bogus amnesia that would be fitted to some narrow and rather shoddy opportunism. Both of our peoples have led an unyielding and irrepressible struggle for independence then, and we both know too how difficult it is, how difficult it can be to secure, vindicate, and deliver on the promises of freedom, justice, and equality that may have motivated the struggle for independence in the first place. The decades following the heady atmosphere of the days of declaring your independence, they are the most challenging. In recent decades, our two countries have undertaken a challenging but rewarding journey from conflict to fruitful and harmonious relations with those who are the successors of our oppressors of the past. And we do so with purpose. In economic terms, too, both Ireland and Vietnam have rapidly moved from being low-income agricultural societies to diversifying their production and achieving significant social and economic advances in a complex globalized world that is ever more interdependent, and not only in trade, but as I suggest now needs a new and imaginative international architecture in an institutional sense, if it is to achieve a diversified democratic future. The question you must ask: will the form of globalization you pursue be one that is democratic? Will it deepen democracy, or will it seek to achieve a speed in which it sees democracy as an impediment? With rapid changes and new opportunities, then, have come tremendous new challenges. The globalized economic and trade structures to which Vietnam and Ireland have been opening, and in which they've been participating ever more actively and with success and intelligence in recent times, are ones that do indeed create great hopes, suggest great opportunities for increased prosperity, more importantly, security and social progress. But they are also ones that involve risk and serious challenges. Everywhere in our global system we can see how deepening inequality is threatening social cohesion, and how, for example, intergenerational justice is threatened as we witness our natural environment degrading at an alarming pace. We should reflect deeply then on the opportunities and the risks before us, risks that we share. No nation should ever be made to rush unthinkingly towards a model of development presented in the illusory guise of an ill-defined modernity. The question must be asked: is the modernity on offer simply an invitation to imitate the practice of others, or does it allow for the release of creativity, moral instinct, be a source of true innovation? Our current models of global trade and finance, production, extraction of resources, ones that we can truthfully say do truly advance the fundamental objective of human development? Do those models protect the hierarchy of purpose that should exist, and indeed that must be restored, between morally purposive economic and social outcomes? Or are they dependent variables on unaccountable forces? And then as to quantifying our achievements or failures, to what extent do growth rates as we currently define and measure them reflect the ability of our economies to respond to the basic needs of our most vulnerable citizens? I'm delighted to be in a university where I can ask these questions. Not all universities in the system would allow such questions in the current atmosphere that is not characterized by widespread pluralism of scholarship. And yet these are questions that we cannot afford to neglect, that we must answer. Yes, we must answer them through the prism of our current circumstances, but now, of course, also within the new parameters of the global agreements that were secured in 2015 in Paris and New York in relation to climate change and sustainable development. The scale of the global challenges we face together requires, it is my deep conviction, not only a recovery of the genuinely idealistic impulses, I prefer to call them moral impulses, which threw our forefathers forward in their best and selfless moments towards a new world of independence. It requires of all of us, and of you young scholars in particular, new models, new paradigms for cooperation at national and international level, and also new scholarship of such a nature as can generate balanced and respectful relationships between all of the peoples of the world, and between humans, indeed, and the forms of life in their fullness in this shared planet. As places of learning, universities and institutes of technology do have a crucial role to play in our transformational tasks, some immediate, ones ever more important long term. We must think long. As Vietnam's great and respected leader Ho Chi Minh once said, for the sake of 10 years we must plant trees. For the sake of 100 years we should cultivate people. As a former university teacher, it is always a pleasure to return to a university setting, and I'm particularly delighted to have this occasion to meet with all of you students of Vietnam National University, a university renowned for the high quality of its academic programs. And it is a privilege to be here with you today, and indeed to have been asked to speak in an institution that will produce the next generation of thinkers, policymakers, analysts, artists, and above all, great concerned human beings. All of you students are, as I was, so fortunate to be able to dedicate several years of your life to learning, to intellectual work, through reading and reflection. So many, and particularly those not as fortunate, rely on you to make the most of this special time in your lives by seeking to think creatively, imagining a bold new world, one very different from that which has so tragically squandered so much of the possibilities of science and technology, of human intelligence, of resources in war and anticipation of war. Generations that have failed to eliminate global poverty, that have claimed hegemony for an industrial system that has come to threaten the future of the planet itself through the degradation of our natural resources. My wish for you in Vietnam is the same as my wish for our Irish students, that you will experience that necessary pluralism of scholarship and teaching that I have spoken, as will enable you to grow into critical, thoughtful, and imaginative, and above all, citizens with courage. My wish is that you will, through your studies, through your exchanges with others, develop the capacity, yes, to define modernity anew, to define modernity in an inclusive, reflexive, ethically, and ecologically responsible way. And my wish for you, in other words, is that you will imagine and give reality to models of development that, while retaining the best of universal developments in available science and technology, will also be rooted in your own culture, in your history, in the deep morality that is in humanity, making space for intuitive wisdom as much as rational applied thought. Descartes did not describe the inevitable end of scholarship. It was one partial strategy for a period of time. And I hope that your knowledge will be a holistic, life-enhancing kind, rather than simply narrowly utilitarian. And my wish for you is that all those skills you are cultivating and will cultivate during your study, skills of patience, clarity in reasoning, persistence, but also gifts of imagination and creativity, the values you rely on for the stuff of your dreams, will remain with you both in your personal journeys and in your collective endeavors. On Sunday, I had the opportunity to visit the Temple of Literature, and one could not be but moved by the 1,000-year-long tradition of scholarly learning embodied in that beautiful place. Such ancient traditions which recall for us a time when intellectual activity was rooted in ethical practice, when the world of man and the world of nature were grasped in harmony. These are ones that have lost nothing of their relevance as we face the challenges of the 21st century. And then afterwards I kept asking my the question, is it not the case that that long scholarly tradition was interrupted by another and was replaced, even suppressed? I profoundly believe that our ability to respond adequately to these challenges they hinge on our ability to achieve a historical reconciliation between ethics, ecology, and economics. The order, and people seek order in their lives, but the order we must pursue must be an open, inclusive, and democratic one, not threatened, but empowered by diversity, one that serves the needs of a global community and a local community, rather than any empire or contending order of elite powers. The Vietnam National University, as the oldest university in Vietnam, celebrating the 110th anniversary of its founding this year, is both then a custodian of the values enshrined by the ancient scholarship and the location for an exploration of the uncharted waters I have been describing, the new horizons of the new century. And I know that Vietnam National University has plays a special part in education in Vietnam through the central part it has played in building international partnerships with educational institutions abroad. I'm so pleased to see the President of University College Cork here. We rely on such partnerships of intelligence, cooperations of mind, moral instincts, exchange of ideas, and sharing of knowledge, if we are to respond to the challenges we face together in relation to climate change, to medicine, to human health, to food security, and to so many other important spheres of human life. If there is now an uncontested scholarship that unequal societies are sick societies, that healthy societies, equal societies, are more healthy societies and are deeply healthy societies, why cannot we take account of this in our policies? All our efforts together will benefit from international cooperation. And as President of Ireland, I'm extremely pleased with these links that have been developed between Vietnam National University and Irish universities, University College Cork, Trinity College Dublin, National University of Ireland Galway. And yesterday at the Presidential Palace, I witnessed alongside President Chan Dai-Quang the renewal of the Memorandum of Understanding between Ireland and Vietnam on cooperation in higher education. This is something we will deepen. This renewal will deepen even further the excellent cooperation that already exists between our universities, which has seen over 100 talented Vietnamese graduates being supported by Irish aid to undertake postgraduate studies in Ireland. I've had the pleasure of meeting a number of those scholars, and I was impressed by the depth of their commitment to scholarship and to using their new skills and expertise to positively contribute to the development of Vietnam and all of the people of Vietnam. I hope that Irish Aid's new pilot programme launched last year with the aim of strengthening long-term research and exchanging links between Irish and Vietnamese universities will yield equally positive results. I'm absolutely delighted that one of the more important institutions is represented here, Dr. Michael Murphy. Vietnam National University's Department of Social Sciences and Humanities, which is at the heart of the new agreement. This new partnership entered into between Vietnam and University College Cork will develop undergraduate and postgraduate programs on rural development, upon which UCC has an internationally recognized expertise. The issue then of sustainable rural development is one of very acute importance to us in Ireland as well, where the number of family farms has been dwindling at what can only be described as at an alarming pace over the last half a century. The challenge of having a sustainable, productive, transparent, with full traceability, agricultural sector, producing products that have all those characteristics, is one with which we in Ireland are very proud. We've made tremendous achievements. But we share with you in Vietnam in the more difficult tasks, and that is finding appropriate ways of supporting our rural communities in the long term, sustainable farm families. I know that in Vietnam, and in particular your country's mountainous areas, you have recognized from your own studies that too many farming families are still living in poverty, and I wish you the very best in all that you do to address their needs. And I hope that we will, in years to come, witness many more constructive educational partnerships, such as the ones I have described, between Ireland and Vietnam, and at every level, partnerships that will be mutually beneficial, partnerships that will invite the brightest young people in our societies to put their intelligence and creativity in the service of the collective objectives of sustainable development for all. However great the global challenges we are facing may be, we can, in this century, if we set about it collectively and creatively, succeed in delivering the promise of sustainable development. And doing so is not some vague utopia. Rather, it will be immensely rewarding to see the fruits of one's intellectual work delivered for the welfare of all. What can be more satisfying than that? You might say much. Well, that is the choice you make morally when you graduate, as to whether you want to see the realization of your life in the satisfaction of extreme individualism, or in offering the benefit of your scholarship for the collective benefit of all. That is why I always salute those in their different opinions who take part in the public world. It is a promise that we must, I think, deliver on urgently, because failure in relation to either of the interrelated challenges of sustainable development or climate change will be a disaster. It would result in the destruction of the prospects of millions to live a life of dignity. Given our existing demographic projections, it will result in massive migratory flows from poverty-stricken areas, first to cities that are unprepared, and then on into the uncertainty of international migratory flows, to which I must say we are currently making such a dismal and disappointing response. I am pleased to say that the two milestone agreements signed last year at the climate conference in Paris in December and at the conference on the new sustainable development goals in New York in September, they do give us good grounds for hope, reason to believe that concern, that's the best part, that concern is shared, that success is possible, is achievable, and that is what is being discussed as I speak in Marrakesh, that we can succeed in rolling back the plights of extreme poverty, hunger, enforced mass migration, and that we can better anticipate conflicts and address environmental degradation. We must ask ourselves about those conflicts. Was there not something we could have done? What has happened to our capacity to anticipate? What of these skills of diplomacy? What are the consequences of our rush to war before diplomacy was exhausted? We must now move on, but these are great and terrible errors that have cost an enormous human cost. But taken together, these two interrelated frameworks for international action on climate change and on sustainable development, they constitute the most ambitious global agenda the nations of the world have ever set themselves. And we are all called forth by them to rise to the challenge of implementing what I think can reasonably be called an agenda of hope. Yes, it is true that the agreement signed at the Paris Climate Conference, COP21, has left a number of issues yet to be resolved. However, I believe that we can all agree that COP21 is a very significant achievement when viewed through the lens of the disappointing failures of the past. It truly represents a turning point in the international response to climate crisis. We now almost universally have agreed scientific indicators. We have an agreed framework for collective action, and most importantly, the climate justice movement is becoming global. Many of our citizens have already started to change their consumption patterns and ways of life. Thousands of cities, provinces, and regions around the world have committed to reducing their greenhouse gas emissions. We are, however, slowly entering a new era, the era of low carbon, with new geopolitical balances in sight and huge economic and environmental opportunities for all countries, including the poorer ones, to use energy more efficiently and to take advantage of the availability of the new technologies to enhance their capacities in the areas of wind, solar, and other forms of renewable energy. And as we speak, that conference on climate, COP22, following on from last year's COP21 in Paris, is underway in Marrakesh. And the targets and objectives that are being brought to that conference, that are brought by our governments, must not be couched in abstract figures. These conferences must never be construed as abstract exercises in diplomatic skill. Success is in text. The fight against climate change. And remember, successes in text are important. We wouldn't have an agreement without their achievement. But the fight against climate change is one that cannot any longer be postponed. It is an issue on which we now, as I said, have full agreement on all the scientific facts. The urgency of our position has been made clear, and we must be aware of our immense responsibility in intergenerational justice, our responsibility to future generations. We must never forget that the choices we are making in this generation will determine the fate of millions of our fellow global citizens in future generations. What is our present position? Issues of poverty, hunger, migration, underdevelopment, climate change, they are all inextricably connected. And recent years have shown that the food security and livelihoods of countless women, men, and children are seriously undermined by rises in sea levels and the dramatic increase in the frequency and severity of rainfall, floods, and droughts. What is at stake is not just the livelihood of this generation, but also the lives of future generations, and even the future of life itself on our planet. And here in Vietnam and in the Mekong Delta region, the destructive effects of climate change are a lived reality for so many of your citizens. In preparing for this state visit, I was shocked to learn how over the past 50 years, the average temperature in Vietnam has increased by approximately 0.5 centigrade, and the sea level has risen by about 20 centimeters. And furthermore, of course, Vietnam's location in the tropical cyclone belt leaves it particularly vulnerable to natural disasters, disasters that tend to affect disproportionately the poorest rural communities. The torrential rain and heavy flooding witnessed by regions of central Vietnam last month, and to which your state is responding, is again a recent example of the urgency of our fight, which must be a collective fight against climate change. And in our international meetings, of course, we must not be slow to acknowledge, but we must do so and then move on. Recognize that the victims of climate change were, in so many cases, neither the authors, nor would they ever be the beneficiaries of the industrial and extraction practices that produced and provoked the problem of climate change and provoked it to its present threatening level. So the two challenges then of climate change and sustainable development, we are agreed, are intrinsically interconnected. And it is becoming increasingly obvious that the effects of extreme weather threaten the effective delivery of a number of basic human rights that the international community has accepted. The right to safe water and food, the right to health, adequate housing. For example, in those states that have in their territory vulnerable small islands, it was never abstract for them. The threat to them is ever more acute and the consequences more severe. And this was made very clear to me in a meeting I had with representatives of the Marshall Islands last year in Paris. Dear friends, you and your generation must succeed where my generation and previous generations have failed. The work of responding to extreme poverty remains everywhere unfinished business. 800 million people living in extreme poverty. Yes, the Millennium Development Goals, which preceded the Sustainable Development Goals, resulted in an overall reduction in poverty at global level. But nearly 1 billion of our citizens in global terms still remain unrelieved, stuck at the bottom of an unequal global system. Indeed, the achievement of the Millennium Development Goals in relation to poverty reduction was quite uneven. In China, Brazil, Vietnam, countries which all had state-led anti-poverty strategies, the achievement is very impressive. If you take their achievement out of the global achievement, you are left with a very uneven set of results. But what of those countries? I think there are inescapable lessons to be drawn from the achievement of in relation to the Millennium Development Goals. There are lessons we must learn for the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals and climate change. It is that the role of state-led initiatives were crucial where success was best achieved. Rising global levels of inequality, poverty, hunger are also not unrelated to those parts of our globe where we had a diminished role of the state. That raises questions. It must be a state that is participatory and a state that is democratic, a state that takes account of change and that it allows for discourse. But in the context of the largely unregulated, financialized model of economic governance, which has gained ground globally over the last 4 decades, it is important that we do not seek to avoid or evade these facts in our recent history. I put it more plainly. What price have we paid for the total abolition of regulation on insatiable international financialized markets, not aimed at releasing productive capital, but speculative capital with appalling consequences? An avatar of such recent models is, for example, the escalating amount of hedge funds controlling future derivatives in basic foodstuffs, which constitutes such a threat for the food security of the poorest people. Markets, we must insist, should be mechanisms for choice, not determinants of life itself. Think of the dilemma people of my age had. We were regularly responding to famine, but yet too many people were silent on the fact that people were speculating on famine and shortage of foodstuffs, regarding it as a commodity to be traded, irrespective of the consequences for populations on the ground in Africa and Asia and South America. Here in Vietnam, you've made huge strides in relation to poverty reduction. While about 70% of the Vietnamese population lived in extreme poverty at the end of the war, those figures have been reduced by more than half over the next quarter of a century. And over that period of time, the Vietnamese government has, as well as that, built up a network of primary and secondary schools in most communities, as well as a basic structure of healthcare across the country. Healthcare as entitlement for every citizen. Electricity is now available to almost all households, and access to clean water and modern sanitation has risen from less than 50% of all households to more than 75%. These are real achievements. May I describe them may I suggest that they constitute a shared social wealth. Ireland has been proud to support in its own modest way such achievements ever since we opened our embassy here in Hanoi 11 years ago. In the intervening time, Ireland and Vietnam have built a very positive development cooperation partnership, centered in particular on the objective of reducing poverty among ethnic and minority groups in Vietnam's mountainous region. Working together, we have sought to help by focusing on inclusive community-based development action that benefits such people as disabled persons groups, community development organizations, and the lesbian, gay, and transgender communities. Such efforts, we hope, encourages and assists the development of the inclusive, participatory civil society to which I have referred. The international community, all of us, face the difficult and most urgent challenge of preventing human trafficking. This terrible plight of human trafficking affects countless numbers of men, women, and children who are often seeking to make better lives for themselves and who are falling prey to ruthless criminals. Responding in that way is necessary, but the factors which contribute to this problem, like most other global issues we are facing today, while very complex and difficult to resolve, they must be tackled at their structural sources. Extreme poverty and migration from rural areas are primary factors, but we need to consider carefully the impact which major development projects, such as the building of dams or the development of certain industries, can have on rural communities and on the continuation of their traditional livelihoods. We must be open to seeing how the unintended consequences of well-meant actions can have unintended consequences that result in displacement. And as governments and as donors, we must be aware that our efforts to improve the lives of citizens through social and economic development can have these unintended social consequences. So, it is critical that we assess all of our policies, all of our development programs, and our engagement in particular with the private sector and corporate investment to anticipate, avoid, mitigate any consequences that might generate human misery and suffering and contribute as source to the problem of displacement and in turn the vulnerability that is involved in trafficking. It is imperative that we plan ahead so that citizens, and particularly the most vulnerable among them, are enabled to adapt in dignity without being forced to sacrifice the traditions and livelihoods to which they are attached, to a changing environment which sees some old models of work coming under pressure and farmland giving way to infrastructural development. We must firmly and actively ensure that all of the men, women, and children who are affected with such change are given access to the necessary tools for adjustment, and that includes education and training, so that they are enabled to remain the dignified authors of their own lives and not the targets or victims of change, that they are the arrows of change, not the targets. The problem of human trafficking then requires a comprehensive response at national and international level. It does so need a concerted international response through bilateral as well as regional and multilateral initiatives. Like Vietnam, Ireland has engaged with the United Nations, with our partners in the European Union, with you, and with your counterparts in ASEAN, to explore how we might best address this grave issue. And I am so pleased that it is being addressed in the context of ASEAN, and there are very important initiatives underfoot there. And Ireland also actively supports the work of the International Organization on Migration, and at regional level, and also the efforts of the International Labour Organization to combat forced labour in Asia. At the national level, domestic legal frameworks are key to combating forced migration, human trafficking. Both Ireland and Vietnam have ratified the United Nations Convention Against Transnational Organised Crime, and we have acceded to the protocol to prevent, suppress and punish trafficking in persons, especially women and children. And both of our countries have also published national strategies to combat human trafficking. But I think the issues I have mentioned as issues of source are of crucial importance. Ireland is committed to continuing its support for the Vietnamese government's efforts to reduce poverty, particularly among ethnic minority communities who are sadly suffering from acute levels of poverty and hence especially vulnerable to human trafficking. Ireland's development cooperation in Vietnam includes support to develop small-scale investment in local communities, to improving their access to services and to markets. We are, for example, providing support to a good practice model in Ha Giang province that aims at ensuring that poor ethnic minority girls stay on in secondary school, and the education in turn makes them less vulnerable to migration and trafficking. Dear friends, colleagues, students above all, however great the challenges of global economies, international trade, unaccountable speculative flows, development itself may be today, Ireland and Vietnam have emerged as countries on a path to greater prosperity, with a myriad of opportunities in sight for new international partnerships. It is now more important than ever that our two countries firmly embrace the principles of sustainable development. Now more than ever, the three pillars of sustainable development matter: social, economic, and environmental. Considerations must be equally central to our planning for the future. I know that former Vietnamese President Sang, when he attended the climate summit in Paris last year, and I was very heartened to hear that sustainability and the need to build up resilience to climate change had been already identified as a key priority by the Vietnamese government. I congratulate the Vietnamese people and their government on such a positive response. Your government has played a very constructive part in contributing to the definition of the new framework for global development upon which the nations of the world have agreed last year at the United Nations headquarters in New York. And I want to, in this regard, to so heartily agree with the words of the incoming United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres when he said that we need to look towards the Sustainable Development Goals to provide a roadmap for the future. And Ireland is both proud and honoured to have had the great responsibility of co-chairing with Kenya the negotiation process for this new global agenda known as Agenda 2030. What distinguishes the new Sustainable Development Goals of Agenda 2030 from their predecessors, the Millennium Development Goals, is their universality of their scope. Indeed, as I hope I've already made clear in this speech, sustainable development is not simply a matter for the so-called developing nations of the global south, such as Vietnam. Sustainable development, the possibility of flourishing in one's own community and culture, and to enable future generations to do so too. That is an equally important challenge for those countries that belong to the so-called West. Basic human rights, such as the right to safe water and food, the right to health and adequate housing, above all to dignity of the person, freedom from fear and gender equality. These are core universal values that are valid for and must be vindicated in every society across the globe. Significantly, the 2030 Agenda invites us to go beyond those previous dichotomies in public discourse between the North and the South, discourses which were reduced to rhetorical flourishes with their broken promises. It was a discourse that lost so many opportunities that we must not now lose. It was a discourse that broke the heart of such great people as Julius Nyerere. I remember reading of his journey home from Canada, where he said, "They are agreeing nothing." After all, we have today, in the so-called North, levels of poverty, inequality, unemployment, and exclusion that point to what I have called a South in the North. And then, too, so many features associated with the industrialized North have migrated to the South. For example, the phenomenon of privileged elites cornering the benefits of growth at the cost of the people in general. All of us are invited to participate in a new and urgent conversation on the common challenges that face all of our nations in this new century. It is a new conversation that is about little less than the future of humanity itself on a shared vulnerable planet, seeking a new ethical globalized economic order that turns the agreements of Paris and New York into realities. The 2030 Agenda is also significant in that it puts forward a holistic approach to development, emphasizing, I quote it, "There can be no sustainable development without peace, and no peace without sustainable development." That is so important. For the first time at multilateral level, peace, political stability, accountability, democracy, and good government are recognized together with economic, social, and environmental pillars as what is a virtual fourth pillar of development policy. And I take this opportunity here in Vietnam National University to emphasize the special importance of goal number 5, which proclaims the need to achieve gender equality and empower all women and girls. Gender equality is a principle that should infuse all our thinking, and not only on development, but in every area of policy. It is an issue that has gained new urgency, as we are witnessing in several regions of the world an appalling resurgence of violence against women and girls, often in refugee camps themselves. Often, of course, all of this is rooted in a hideous ideology of female inferiority. We should not have to wait 4 or 5 years to end this. Ireland and Vietnam are two nations that share an equally firm commitment to defending the principle of equality and dignity of our women citizens. We are two nations who know what they owe, including at the moments of their struggle for independence, to the courageous women from the past. We are reminded, for example, of the Trung sisters, who in 40 AD led the Vietnamese people's struggle against the army of Ma Yang. As one Vietnamese poem from the 15th century put it, "All the heroes bowed their head in submission. Only the two sisters proudly stood up to avenge the country." The life of the Trung sisters, and those like them echoes across the century. The courageous deeds, of course, of another pair of sisters in Ireland, the Go Booth sisters from the west of Ireland, who played a prominent role in the revolution which stirred Ireland at the turn of the last century. The elder Constance was one of the military leaders of the insurrection of 1916, while the younger Winneva, a pacifist at heart, was instrumental in organizing the women's trade union and the suffragist movement in Britain, where she lived for most of her life. Some of you here this morning may have seen the compelling exhibition organized by the Irish Embassy at the Vietnam Women's Museum to mark the anniversary of Ireland's 1916 rebellion, highlighting as it did the central part played by women in Ireland's struggle for freedom. I have no doubt that this exhibition found a strong resonance with those who viewed it here in Hanoi, the capital of a state in whose liberation and evolution so many brave women have played and continue to play a crucial role. It should come as no surprise, therefore, that the Vietnamese government is so committed to the promotion of gender equality. In addition to the guarantees enshrined in your constitution, I know that milestone legislative measures, which we all welcome, were recently introduced to strengthen the position of women in Vietnamese society, such as the 2006 law on gender equality and the 2007 law on the prevention and control of domestic violence. These legislative initiatives, I am sure, will be welcomed by the Vietnamese people of all generations and welcomed all over the world. Of course, as with all spheres of equality, gender equality is, here in Vietnam as well as in Ireland and everywhere in the world, very much an incomplete project. We must always be mindful not to lose sight of the fundamental importance of achieving gender equality in all aspects of our lives as political representatives, as citizens, as students, as workers and educators. This centrality of the values of justice, equality and dignity to our daily lives leads me to a final point, that of who must take ownership of the implementation of our sustainable development goals, our response to climate change. Agenda 2030 is not simply a crucially important dimension of government policy and multilateral negotiation. It is a challenge of which each and every one of us as citizens must take ownership in the way we shape and live our lives, how we deliver our abilities in intellectual, political, and associative engagements. For the deep change we so urgently need to take place at global level, it is essential that all those concerned, national governments, civil society organizations, academia, business and citizens, all play an active role in the achievement of Agenda 2030, just as they did play a crucial role in its definition. Parliaments and citizens across the world must not avert their gaze or ever be encouraged to do so when it comes to the implementation of this globally agreed agenda. They must ensure that strategies on sustainable development are translated into clear, specific national priorities, action plans, responsibilities, budgets. Citizens must also be able and willing to hold governments to account to ensure that decisions are truly based on the needs of the people, all of the people, including those who are marginalized and most vulnerable, our brothers and sisters in the human family. That, of course, may be easier than holding some multinational corporations to account, yet it must be done. What I have described can never be traded unconditionally. We cannot allow ourselves to be intimidated by threats from powerful corporate interests, such as, for example, corporations who put millions of tons of poison into the waters of Ecuador and who, when brought to account and a fine having been imposed, went on to say that they would fight the fine imposed, as they put it, until hell freezes over, and then fight it on the ice. This must end, this unaccountability. We must have accountability, support for international law, and if that requires reforming the United Nations, let's set about it. We are all co-responsible, dear friends, in contributing to creating the right atmosphere for the wide-ranging transformation we need. The atmosphere of a new moment in global relations, one that can yield an integrated, culturally sensitive and environmentally sound version of development. An atmosphere as will invite all of us to be courageous in taking charge of change. We must keep the momentum going and retain and inform the public interest in these issues. Here in Vietnam, the energy and enthusiasm with which the people and the government have embraced the new Agenda 2030 is heartening and encouraging, and it is an example to others. As is the case in Ireland, and indeed everywhere else for that matter, it is important that all ministries as well as provincial and local governments are fully engaged in the process of planning and implementation. Indeed, our own experience in Ireland tells us that a whole of government and a whole of society approach will be the key drivers to the success of such wide-ranging transformative agenda. Of course, real progress on any of the 17 goals agreed in New York is also predicated upon the international community's ability to secure appropriate levels of funding, with the United Nations and the World Bank having estimated that the cost of global implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals is in trillions rather than billions. As we look at new ways of financing development, I strongly believe that it is imperative that we keep the issue of debt restructuring at the center of our discussions. Indeed, the unsustainable debt position of so many countries, rich and poor, gravely undermines their capacity to plan and execute long-term sustainable development programs. No serious or plausible agreement on development can ignore debt management issues, and more particularly, may I state very clearly, the central question of the role of the state and its financial capacity. They must be released into the capacity to make the necessary response. States must be allowed the space to implement the new agenda, and that may require dealing with the related issue of global debt restructuring. Indeed, while it is important to explore innovative financing options and the role of the private sector in funding development, the state and its agencies, the multilateral agencies, will have a pivotal role in ensuring the long vision and inclusive approach that is necessary for the delivery of development policies that can benefit all citizens. The problems posed by the financialization of the global economy, to which I have made reference, have been identified now, in the last decade alone, by a multitude of distinguished economists, scholars, and analysts who have convincingly highlighted the correlation between the current financialized version of the global economy we live with and the growth of inequalities worldwide, the precariousness of many economies, the current 8-to-1 ratio of on account of speculative capital flows to capital used for productive purposes is one that threatens our ability to effectively provide globally for the implementation of Agenda 2030. Achieving Agenda 2030 requires, I suggest, the diverting of the ever-widening river of speculative financial capital towards the real economy and the creation of sustainable employment and investment. The growing influence of respected dissenting voices to the current structure of those globalized capital flows include those of Pope Francis. It indicates perhaps that the hegemonic days of strident neoliberal economics that advocated a version of the market that would extend into every part of life, that would be free of any state regulation, that would seek to define existence itself, that those days then might be coming to an end. The scholarship indicates that. The detritus of such ideological extremes, of course, is all around the global society, and I very much welcome the fact that after many decades, the role of the state is again being re-examined. And it needs re-examination. It needs to be made participatory, recognized as a vital one in responding to both existing and emerging global challenges. There are then many encouraging signs that a radical rethinking of our economic models is underway, pointing to the need to control international finance, to make it accountable. We see two suggestions for alternative measurements of growth emerging in such institutions as the UNDP, the United Nations Development Project, and the World Bank. And there is undoubtedly a new multipolar world in the throes of emergence. The opportunities are real to depart from the failed models of development of the past in order to deliver new models that are rooted in an ethical consciousness, seeking to build on the inescapable solidarity which can bind together all societies across the globe. Those new models in the throes of emergence will not, however, become reality without a profound renovation of our multilateral system. The United Nations as an institution will have a crucial role to play in efficiently supporting, coordinating, and monitoring the implementation of Agenda 2030 at international level. More broadly, we need a new architecture of legitimate and well-resourced multilateral institutions with consensual policies that are based on good and pluralist scholarship, an ability to translate agreed principles into action, but also genuine representativeness. And even small steps are important. I welcome, for example, the efforts in the World Bank Group to increase the voice and representation of so-called developing and transition countries within the bank. So much more remains to be done, however, to create the appropriate framework for the governance of macroeconomic and financial policies in our interdependent world. Marfakaska, finally, to end. So importantly, may I say how crucial the United Nations work on disarmament and non-proliferation of weapons is. This is an area in which Ireland and Vietnam are aligned and actively engaged. It is work that is critical for a safer, more secure world. And there is no doubt that political leadership is fundamental to the achievement of such critical global objectives. I'm very confident that the incoming United Nations Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, with his exceptional experience of the work of the United Nations on the ground, will continue the good work of UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon in leading the world into a more sustainable path. Dear students, our cordial grain, dear friends, may I emphasize again that eradicating the poverty and its associated suffering, which undermines the lives of so many men, women, and children on our planet, is the greatest moral challenge we as a global community face. It is a challenge that, I repeat, we have not met with adequacy of mind and heart in previous generations. The scale of the change required in both policy and mindset should not lead anybody to feel overwhelmed or powerless. Our new international agreements, climate change, sustainable development, are global in their reach and in their demands. They ask us to meet the challenge by delivering the global consciousness and the globally responsible actions required. The scale and ambition of the 2030 Agenda should serve not to intimidate us, but rather to inspire us. And I believe that in all of this there is room to learn from the deep and growing friendship, the cooperation between the people of Vietnam and the people of Ireland. By adopting a new set of transformational global goals, the nations of the world have given themselves little less than the task of crafting a reflective and holistic vision for development and social progress. Your generation has a historic opportunity to lay the foundations of a new model for human flourishing and social harmony, enduring peace, one that is shared between all those who dwell on this planet, and one that is shared too between this generation and those yet to come. So let us commit today together to make this promise thrive and bloom. My hope for this new century, and I know your hope, is that we will manage together to build a cooperative, caring, non-exploitative civilization informed by the best of the traditions and institutions of the nations of the world, but also by the diversity of our collective experiences and memories, all of our sciences and technology, linked with humanity, including those that will inevitably recall old wounds, failures and opportunities lost, but also visions revived and futures that you will imagine and bring to be. And the people of Vietnam will be, I am certain, so much stronger for the enormity of what you've been asked to forgive, but which you are not required ever to forget. You are an indomitable people capable of treating all of the challenges I have mentioned. My hope is that we will together recognize and give solid institutional foundations to the solidarity that binds us together as human beings. Enjoy and cherish the responsibility we share for our common planet, and vindicate the dignity of all those who dwell on it. We are, in the end, all but migrants in time and space and circumstance, transient travelers, who must do our best to pass on to the next generation a hospitable ground on which they can flourish and change, and we must try to do it together. Thank you so much.
Gur i míle maithante. Cad